6. Indictivum ad quod per praecoem homines evocabantur. The climb and descent of Masada and the long trek twice around its northern base had brought continuous shooting pain to Silva's bad leg. So, to distract his thought, he brooded upon what the Jew had said to him. What you have done to the world. A wretched man whose doubts and use of might. It was absurd rubbish, of course, but he had spoken with the same conviction displayed by the older Jew called Ezra. Then they really must believe what they were saying. And if so, Sheva was right. There was just not going to be any way her iron-headed people could be rescued from disaster. Silva reluctantly decided the expedition had been a failure. By the gods, it served a man right for trying to deal with an essentially barbaric people in a civilized fashion. Yet think of Sheva. Perhaps that very barbaric influence was a part of her magic. There was ever a hoyden quality about her, as might be seen among the street urchins of Rome, who were so often also little savages, because they fought for everything in life. She had the same limitless energy. Her eyes took on the same luster when she pleased, and she could put on a mask of complete innocence, or remove it as easily as a garment. You must constantly remind yourself, Sheva is an Oriental, as much so as Eleazar ben Yair. There are depths within them you will never understand, and you should waste no more time trying. Take Eleazar ben Yair as your antagonist and defeat him. Take Sheva as your woman and stop concerning yourself about the legal niceties of the union. Fill Praeneste with her and all she means to you. Lay in a cask or so of fruity albanum for those ladies who must come to inspect her. If they drink enough of the stuff, they will believe she is a Vestal Virgin. Sit back and thank the gods for sending you a Jewess named Sheva, and be content you have once again found a woman you can love. The mountains of Moab were fringed with scarlet, and the whole of the eastern sky had become a soft coverlet of mauve when Silva and Geminus passed through the Praetorian Gate. Silva said, "I am weary. I cannot march like a soldier any more." He wanted to say he was exhausted, and the leg was giving him some excruciating pain, but he could not bring himself to such a confession before Geminus. A Roman of the equestrian class is accursed, he reminded himself. He can never indulge in the balm of crying, but we cannot rest as yet, Geminus. We have some nuisance business with Pomponius Falco. Go to his tent and bring him to me. Geminus turned away, and Silva continued up the street, as the day crept up behind him. Just as he entered his tent, the full sun struck the faces of his guards, seeming to cast their features in polished bronze. It was almost dark within the tent, and it was a moment before his eyes adjusted to the feeble light. Then he saw waiting for him Timoleon, the surgeon, and Albinus and Cornelius, and instantly he sensed something had gone wrong. Timoleon bowed and mumbled his greeting. He is the only Greek I have ever known, Silva thought, whose Greek I find nearly incomprehensible. "Sire, I must bring sad news," he said. "Your guest, Pomponius Falco, is dead. I was called to his tent at the mid-watch and found him stricken beyond recall. A great Roman." Silva walked slowly to his chair and sat down heavily. He forced himself to concentrate on Timoleon's peculiarly difficult Greek, while at the same time his mind churned with the need for immediate action. There was Falco's threat about rejoining his Germans by noon. When I arrived, sire, partial rigor mortis had already set in, and my first impression was that he might have suffered an attack of hydrophobia. I learned, however, the deceased had no record of the affliction, his worst being recurrent attacks of impetigo, some evidence of which was still apparent. For such troubles, I normally prescribe a mixture of saffron, lycium, verdigris, myrrh, and charcoal in equal proportions, boiled in raisin wine. Come to the point, Timoleon. Why did he die? Silva's voice was flat and hollow. His whole attention had turned to Albinus and Cornelius. I beg you, sire, not to conclude I have lost my wits, yet it is my diagnosis: the man drowned. In the desert? In the desert? In the desert? Are you mad? I use the term loosely, sire. In this case, suffocation is perhaps a more exact term. Under certain admittedly rare conditions, it is possible for a person to suffocate or drown in his own phlegm. Perhaps that is what happened. I could be certain if permitted to make an autopsy. Permission denied. Greek surgeons were always wanting to experiment. Are you certain he was not murdered? I am positive, sire. There are no marks of violence about his body and no evidence of any struggle within the tent. However, I was puzzled at his being in chains. What about these two? Silva frowned at Albinus and Cornelius. Since the deceased was restrained, he had requested they be alert to assist him during the night. They expected to be summoned, but after some hours no summons came, so they decided to investigate. On discovering the situation, they found me out at once and begged me to make all haste, which I did. Even so, it was obvious the deceased had left this life some hours previously. Now Silva turned on Albinus and Cornelius. His voice was tense with anxiety. Tell me one thing for your lives. Where are the Usipats and the women? There was a long silence, then Cornelius ventured to speak. We were not told, sire. That is the truth. Would a hot iron make you see the truth more clearly? Silva watched their faces carefully. If Falco's threat was to be believed, there was not time to squander on such business, and usually information obtained under use of the iron was the truth of convenience. Here, even the time to prove a lie was not to be spared, for there remained little more than 5 hours until noon. Tell me, he said as quietly as he could manage. Tell me all you know at once, and you will be rewarded by a quick and safe trip home. Otherwise, you will never reach it. He saw Albinus glance fearfully at Cornelius. Then he said, We were not told, sire. We were advised to pack in anticipation of leaving this morning. I would suppose our escort might be somewhere along the road waiting for us. Believe me, sire, I beg you, that is all we know. Silva rubbed at his weary eyes. Think, he warned himself. Think, though your mind begs for rest. Consider this as you would a military situation. Falco would have been in haste to reach the more comfortable climates of Jerusalem and then the seacoast. Certainly, then, he would not have departed to the south along a different route, which led only through interminable desert to the Arabian Gulf. Therefore, somewhere in the wilderness to the north were a handful of savages, and Sheva. In that region there were innumerable places of concealment. No time to explore them all, therefore somehow the quarry must be made to show themselves. For a long moment he stared thoughtfully at Albinus and Cornelius. Then suddenly he raised his voice and shouted for Attius his aide. The young tribune appeared almost instantly. Attius, you will do the following with the utmost dispatch. Call Rubrius Gallus from his ramp. I have an urgent engineering problem for him. Tell him to hurry. Here, have the centurion Lupercus Clemens find a Jew who at least vaguely resembles Eleazar ben Yair, and put him in mobile chains. Advise the centurion Gemenes he may redeem himself by killing some Germans, and now send someone to take these two fawns out of my sight. He nodded in acknowledgment of Attius's salute, then turned to Timoleon. Doctor, you stay here. We may require certain technical advice, and while you wait to think of some potion that will restore my energies. (6.2) Soon after the trumpet notes announced the beginning of another Hebrew day, Eleazar ben Yair broke his fast with a single meal cake and a handful of dried figs. As usual, he regretted his inability to wash properly, and he thought ruefully how many mornings it had been since anyone on Masada had seen soap. All attempts to discover some substitute form of mineral alkali had failed. Washing in plain water did little to remove the red dust stains of Masada. He went directly to the synagogue, where the council was assembling according to a now long established custom. It had also become custom, although not a requirement, for each man to mount the parapet at the western end of the synagogue, which vantage point they could look almost directly down upon the Romans. By raising their eyes slightly, they could also observe the activities about Silva's personal camp. Instinctively, on viewing the progress of the ramp and the ever-impressive military spectacle below, each man would thoughtfully stroke his beard and make his own estimation of future events. They remained fascinated spectators while they automatically wrapped phylacteries about their left arms in the direction of their hearts and waited for Hillel to call them to prayer. Eleazar viewed most synagogue ceremonies with impatience. If most of the able-bodied men on Masada were going to stand about and commune with God for so long each day, then why not devote more attention to the prayers created by the Hebrew poets? What greater beauty would be found in any language? Yet since the siege of Masada began, he had never been able to give his complete ear to them. Always there was the grating distraction of the ramp building, a constant and harsh offense to the verbal magic of the prayers. Always there was his preoccupation with an enemy who never seemed to sleep, and Hillel's constant hammering at mortals and the law. As he pointed behind his pulpit at the ark, where the rolls of the law were deposited, his eyes took on the same flaming intensity as the ever-burning lamp. Oh, I say to you 5 things Canaan taught his descendants: love one another, love robbery, love licentiousness, hate your master, and do not speak the truth. The priests live in their own world, Eleazar thought. They refuse to recognize we are marooned in the desert, losing the fight for our lives. On this morning, he became more than ever impatient with Hillel's lengthy prayer, because he knew the time had come at last when a terrible choice must be made. Now, for the first time, he was actually grateful for the existence of the council. At least now, the choice would not be his alone. The men with whom he obstinately his obstinacy or refusal to accept his dictates without question seemed on this morning to be good men, trying as best they could to surmount the impossible and govern the unmanageable. Two were absent, the irreplaceable Ezra and the flabby Zidon, but Alexis was still present, although strangely subdued. The slippery one, with his highly developed instincts of self-preservation, must sense the final encounter was near, and there was the normally fierce Esau, who had rushed through his marriage to the Essene girl, and had ever since seemed in a trance. Hopefully he would recover in time to face the Romans as he always had. There were still the stalwarts Javan and Kittim, sons of Tema. There was huge Asher, son of Joktan, and scrawny, buck-toothed Nimrod, son of Abram. And there was Heth, son of Ezra, a strikingly handsome man who had been appointed in his father's place. Another replacement elected to the council over Eleazar's strong objections was Matthias, son of Yeshua. He had been appointed to take Zidon's place and unfortunately not only resembled him physically, being weak of eye and spirit, but was also possessed of Zidon's whining manner and fearful approach to all matters. Now, with the morning sun shafting through the entrance and splashing on their backs, these men were led by Hillel in praise of God, and because it was one of the days decreed by Ezra and Nehemiah for special devotions, he read from the Torah. Afterward, the Mishnah was spoken by Shimeon ben Yozar, a gaunt black-skinned Idumean whose posturing and hollow profundities exasperated Eleazar. He tried to persuade himself all of this was good for the spirits of those on Masada, but another voice persisted in reminding him that soldiers of the 10th Legion had not troubled to read the 5 books of Moses. At last, when religious tradition had been satisfied, Eleazar was able to stand before the assembly and tell them of his meeting with Flavia Silva. What we desperately require now, he warned them, is a Joshua, a man who can command the sun to stop. Yet perhaps a near miracle is at hand, if I have not the perception to recognize it. You must understand, Silva made no promises. If we go down to the Romans, we will be their slaves, and it is as simple as that. Is that a miracle? Alexis's deep voice rumbled from far in the rear of the synagogue. If we tell our people of Silva's offer, then we will stand alone upon Masada. Nimrod said quietly, we must tell them. To keep such a matter to ourselves would be unforgivable. Esau challenged them. Why? Once the people know there is a hope for life, they will say it is better to breathe a foul odor rather than not to breathe at all. We will never stop them. Perhaps, interrupted Matthias, we should now seriously consider going down to Silva, but make it an action led by us for the benefit of all. If we were not in the synagogue, I would give thee the word for such drivel. Esau snarled. I say tell them nothing, Asher shouted. Javan stood beside him and said, the Romans are not here yet. I'm going to fight them if I have to stay here alone. Eleazar held up his hands, clapping them above his head to gain attention. It was always so. He remembered, if 10 Jews convened for any purpose whatever, there were 10 different opinions, each much cherished by its originator. By tomorrow morning, the Romans will be knocking at our gate. We must make a choice. We may keep Silva's visit our secret and hope none of us talks in our sleep. Or we may lie to our people and say the Romans have sworn to kill every man, woman, and child, regardless of his usefulness. With nothing to lose, then, perhaps, we will put up a fight, or we may deceive our people deliberately, hoping to arouse their fighting spirit. We can promise them that if they throw back the Romans, the way will be open for our escape to easier lands beyond Judea. Eleazar hesitated. He had thought on this morning to expose his darkest thoughts before the council. He would lay them out one by one, pulling them from his tortured brain like knives along impaled, and he would say, "Here are the thoughts which have haunted me, and which so far I have not found the courage to announce. Help me to emerge from this lonely darkness. Help me, for you are my brothers." On this morning, with the sounds from the ramp crashing upon his thoughts, he could not bring the words he wanted to his lips. He saw only a sea of questioning eyes before him. Alaxus, the slippery one, Esau, the Sicarius, Javan and Kittim, glowering Ashur, uncertain Nimrod, and Heth, and Matthias, and Hillel also. Their eyes were saying, "Lead us." And he was faltering while the morning sun spewed radiance all through the synagogue. And he was suddenly dumb for the first time in his life, he who had ever before been in such complete command of his tongue. He who was Eleazar ben Yair of Galilee was barely able to make a sound. "Tell us what you think we should do," Heth was saying, and he could only shake his head instead of replying. And when Hillel said, "We must put our trust in God our Savior," he could not even find words to object. Just at this moment, with the voices of the council echoing all about him, he could only visualize the faces of Miriam and Reuben, and how their eyes might appeal to him if he did what he thought was right. He saw their eyes, and he saw the wrinkled, pock-marked face of old Abigail. (6.22) After this morning's inspection of the casemates and towers, he made his way to Abigail, although he was not at all sure he was prepared to withstand an inspection by her black eyes. He found her squatting as usual in her black robe, and the smoke from her oven so enveloped her figure, she seemed to be perched on a blue cloud. "Why have you come to me, great man?" she rasped. "Why suddenly do you bother coming to see this old crone you remember only at your convenience? Your conscience is troubling you. Or have you simply decided to peek in and see if an old spider is dead? And if so, how does the carcass smell?" "Eleazar, the Great One," she cackled. "What a fine trap you have fashioned for yourself and your people. Moses led us out of the wilderness, and you lead us into it. And more cleverly, you have placed us on top of a mountain from which there is no escape. Tell me, Great One, you who are a fisherman with the arrogance of a king, and I know you were a better fisherman than a soldier, or you would long ago have starved to death. Tell me, you who are so clumsy at guile, tell this old woman how many shekels the Romans paid you to bring us here. Tell me this, so that at least when I die, it will not be from curiosity." Eleazar smiled and squatted beside her. "My ears inform me you are in fine spirit for an old hag this morning, but my eyes reveal nothing through this wall of smoke. You are not cooking. Why not douse the fire?" "It warms my bones, boy, bones that have caged the passions of better men than you will ever be." "There is no need to recite your record of copulations. It is as legendary as your sweet and gentle nature. And I am so struck by your ravishing beauty on this morning, it is difficult for me to believe you are only 98 years old. I have also been insulted by better men than you will ever be. I have not yet reached 70, and under the protection of such as yourself, never expect to. I sit here all day and ask myself whatever happened to the brave Jews. Were they all lost at Jerusalem? Are those still sucking on their mother's tits and inheriting your meekness? Bah! The Jewish men are all dead. You baboons who have survived are Egyptians in disguise. Now, what have you come here to cry about? Eleazar coughed and fanned the smoke away from his face. I am in grave trouble, Abigail. This is new. She spat at the sand between her feet. I'm not your mother, so stay out of my womb. I will now tell you, although I dare not admit it elsewhere, I do not believe we can defeat the Romans. A man who locks defeat in his thoughts by night is doomed by morning. If he is a leader, does he have any right to admit his despair to his people? Or is it his duty? Should he stand down from his office and make way for a more resolute man, even when he knows the situation is hopeless? Or should he carry on to the very end? I came here to seek your opinions on these matters, worthless though they might be. I came here because I have nothing else to do and wish to give company to the aged, lewd, old hags, though they may be. I came for no reason, but I would not object if I heard your silken voice soothing my worries and removing these thorns from my conscience. What you name your conscience is more likely your foolish pride. What benefit would there be if you told our people the truth? They neither expect nor appreciate truth from leaders. Does it do any good to tell a man who is going to die that he's going to die? If he already knows it, he is only embarrassed watching you suffer in the telling. And if he does not know it, then you are a robber of all his final joys, and the murderer of his hopes. If I tell them, then, they will go down to the Romans and survive. Are you sure? And if you forsake them as their leader, who would take your place? Esau? That conniving lecher would be seducing someone's daughter while the Romans storm the gates. Alexis? He would make an exchange with Silva, the people of Masada, for his own freedom, Ashur? He is even more stupid than you. And as for the rest of your confederates, they are not worth. She grunted and spat into the sand again, and her lids descended to hood her eyes until they were nearly invisible. Do not pretend you are dozing, old hag. Your silence hums like a beehive. I'm thinking of a Roman defeat. I'm wondering if Galilean trash such as yourself could be capable of achieving it. I am meditating on the possibility of your inspiring the people of Masada to a deed far beyond the abilities of ordinary mortals. You must call upon your eloquent tongue to inspire them as never before. You must convince them that they must greet the Romans from beyond the river of silence. Eleazar tried to smile. I thought I should know that if I waste my morning fishing for counsel among old women, my only catch would be senile evasions. Abigail reached out her tiny hand, which was so like the claw of a bird, and touched his arm. The Romans thirst for our blood, she whispered. Let us deny them, if we have remaining so much as a vial of courage. then it will be our victory. .3 By now the hills of Moab were wriggling in the scorching air, and in places along the distant horizon the same hills were sliced through the sheets of undulating water, and others floated on their summits halfway between earth and sun. Sheva watched the sun with growing concern, for the words of Pomponius Falco still rang in her ears. I anticipate a reunion no later than noon tomorrow. Until then you are my guarantee of liberation, and when we meet in good spirits you shall have yours. You have thus far been very sensible, so I ask you to remember the men entrusted with your care are savages. Since they are rather childish, I must caution you not to tease them. Long before dawn they had come to this narrow wadi in the Judean slope, which tumbled down to the Dead Sea. The broken rim of the wadi blocked all view to the south except the top half of Masada itself. But to the north it was possible to observe a continuation of an elevated mirage which she knew must reflect the oasis of En-Gedi. Directly down the wadi, fringing the shore of the sea, was the supply route between fertile Palestine and the Roman forces at Masada. 2 long caravans have already passed bound south for the camps, and the yellow dust from the last still hung in the air. Three of the Germans were sprawled behind a great rock which had given them protection from the earlier sun. Now, with it full upon them, they still slept and snored mightily. The others squatted immobile, except when they moved to scratch at their hairy bodies. She was certain they would not remain much longer in the wadi, since they had brought neither food nor water, and she was convinced her own thirst must match that of one German who reminded her of a great ape she had once seen displayed in the Alexandrian market. He had become restless and climbed to the lip of the wadi, and now lay on his belly, looking down upon the road. The air was so still she could hear the rattle of stones as he occasionally shifted his weight. To ease her increasing fear, she imagined herself with Flavius Silva. "You unspeakable slut," he would say. "It was not to save your family, but your own precious skin, and you consented to lie with a Roman. Were you afraid Falco would damage your Semitic beauty or your chicken heart when you betrayed the man who offered you his life? Tell me, dear General, do you seriously believe your friends in Rome would let you push me down their aristocratic throats? They would see what you refuse to see, and say not only is she a Jewess, but a craven adventuress, and obviously for sale. What would you do, dear General, if you sired a half-Jewish, half-Roman son? You will be known as the conqueror of Masada. Would you send your son here to see where his father killed so many Jews, and where his mother lay in your arms while thousands of her people died? Better to invent some story of a Roman mother, so he may march up and down in style." She closed her eyes and whispered, "Let him hate me, God. Make him drive me away." She heard a rattle of stones and looked up to see the German sliding down from the crest of the wadi. He roused the others, and 2 of them came to her. They seemed troubled, when she quickly retreated from their extended hands, then pleased when she cautiously returned. They pointed anxiously down the wadi. seeming to urge her with their strange gutturals. Then she understood, for a small caravan was moving along the road, bound away from Masada. One of the Germans tried to push her forward. She swung her arm to knock him away. If Pomponius Falco had come to collect his liberation ticket, she resolved there was no reason to make it easier for him. When she saw the caravan stop, she slowed her descent until she actually sauntered down the wadi. As she approached, with the Germans moving protectively about her, she was shocked to recognize Eleazar ben Yair as part of the caravan. He was on foot and in chains, and she thought, Adonai, now I have committed the ultimate betrayal. She saw Pomponius Falco mounted on a horse at the head of the procession. He was supported on both sides by his two pretty boys. Was he drunk? Behind Eleazar were 2 cavalrymen, and behind them more than a score of Jews on foot. They were harnessed to the heavy supply wagon. A single cavalryman rode at the tail of the procession. She looked to the south toward the looming bulk of Masada. There was no dust cloud of another procession, nothing but empty desert. So, General, you have finally decided you have had enough of your Jewess. She lingered while the thirsty Usipats quickened their pace and drew further ahead of her. They waved at Falco, but made straight for the supply wagon. Suddenly she halted. Thirst and the heat had certainly affected her sight, for she saw the caravan seem to scatter, as if it were a great animal coming apart. The cavalryman left the line and circled behind the approaching Usipats. Then the Jews at the wagon threw off their harnesses. She saw the flash of metal in the sunlight, and they threw themselves upon the astonished Germans. Before these had a chance to draw their weapons, a cluster of legionaries leaped from the wagon itself and also fell upon them. There were a few moments of hoarse shouting mixed with the heavy sounds of bodies locked in combat. Then the desert became silent again. Finally, a man came running toward her, and though he wore the garments of a Jew, she recognized him as the centurion Jimenez. He stopped, and offering his great hand, growled, "I hope you are as good for him as you are trouble to me." When he led her to the supply wagon, she saw that Falco's eyes were closed, and that he was supported on the horse by a cage fashioned of narrow metal bars. The structure was held together by leather thongs and supple enough for his arms to respond to the movement of the horse. Glancing up at him, Jimenez said, "In my opinion, he looks better dead than he did alive." Before the legionaries had pulled Falco from the horse and dumped his body in the wagon, the buzzards had already swooped down upon the fallen Germans. 6.3.2 When he had been assured Sheva was safely returned to her tent, Flavius Silva at last surrendered to his weariness and slept. It was evening before he wakened again and reluctantly decided against calling for the Jewess. Instead, he summoned certain of his officers, and as if they were totally unaware of the fact, solemnly announced the death of Pomponius Falco. Of course we were distressed such a distinguished Roman departed life while our guest. It therefore behooves us to honor him in a style appropriate to an envoy of Vespasian. The funeral will be at tomorrow's evening watch. I depend on each of you in your various departments to make suitable preparations. Thus, on the following day, when the flaming sun had submerged behind the western hills in the soft blue twilight and wrapped the desert, Flavius Silva stood bareheaded watching the smoke rise from an enormous funeral pyre. All of his staff wore their finest armor and were assembled behind him. On his left hand stood his lictors and their fasces wreathed on laurels, and on his right his standard-bearers. Silva was pleased with the preparations and had so expressed himself to those officers responsible. Special couriers had been dispatched to bring flowers from the oasis of En-Gedi, and the cavalrymen on the fastest horse had ridden night and day to bring a traditional sprig of cypress from Joppa. Suitable wood for the pyre had been a problem until Rubrius Gallus, who had appeared dutifully surprised to learn of Falco's passing, suggested breaking up the ballistas which could not be used against Masada. Ordinarily, those torsion machines would have been employed along with the rest of the 10th's material quota to shower the enemy with short javelins and bolts. But the desert atmosphere had somehow caused their specially treated ropes to deteriorate and lose all elasticity. Attempts had been made to substitute horsehair and even the sinews of animals, without success. The Legion's normal battery of 60 had been reduced only 24 serviceable machines. Silva had agreed to their destruction, commenting only that he was glad they were not fighting on the Gallic Plain or British Moor, where ballistas were indispensable. Lack of perfumes and spices to sweeten the funeral fire had also presented a vexing problem, but the ever-resourceful Ummidius Fabatus, after a great deal of sighing, had finally discovered a small supply of incense, myrrh, and cassia available among the Nabatean tradesmen. All of this had been carefully recorded by Silva's scribe, who had also been instructed to report meticulously on the ensuing ceremonies. The completed history was to be presented to all who remained of Falco's party, Cornelius, Tertullus, and the slave known as Albinus. They were to deliver the manuscript to Rome, along with their first-hand account of how the Usipats had been ambushed by a marauding band of Jews. Silva had looked Rubrius Gallus straight in the eye and said his melancholy was such at the loss of his distinguished guest he did not feel up to delivering a eulogy. Would good friend Gallus mind? Gallus had declined with equal solemnity, explaining that he had been so preoccupied with the ramp he had been unable to become better acquainted with Vespasian's envoy and feared to do his ghost injustice. It was therefore agreed to dispense with a eulogy, and instead Silva would personally place a coin on Falco's lips for Charon. He chose a shekel depicting the head of Vespasian on the face and Judea conquered on the reverse. All of this was recorded. As the flames crackled upward along the pyre and began to lick at the splendid couch which supported Falco's body, Silva was pleased to see the ceremonies commence according to the law of the 12 tables. There were the prescribed number of flute players in attendance. No mean feat, Silva amused, since there were not enough flute players in the entire legion to make up the required complement of 10. His orders had been, let those who are the musicians make the noise. Find other men to stand there with flutes or their mouths, and have them go through the motions. Tradition also demanded that everything that had been agreeable to the deceased should be provided and cremated with him, for use in the next world. Silva had gravely inquired if either Albinus or Cornelius would care to join the ghost on the pyre, and he had pretended to be surprised when they declined. Waiting now as darkness slipped over the desert, he glanced over his shoulder and saw that even the Jews were impressed with such a grand funeral. Good. The cessation of work on the ramp would not be entirely time wasted. Now, in accordance with his orders, 2 cohorts were parading the regulation 3 times around the pyre, from right to left with their ensigns inverted, and striking their weapons against each other, as if Pomponius Falco had been a most illustrious commander. For a moment, Silva was intrigued with the brief pantomime occurring a few paces down the slope from him. There Cornelius, Tertullus, and Albinus stood side by side. As the flames rose and obscured the couch, he saw they were holding hands. He found it difficult to hold back a smile when he suddenly remembered something Falco had said about duplicity being everywhere about. When finally the parade had finished, he raised his hand in salute to the pyre, and he whispered in Latin, "Farewell, P.F. As you also quite recently remarked, no one of any sophistication believes in Gloria Patria any longer." Six point 3.3. Once again Flavius Silva lay watching the dawn present itself in the form of a crescent at the peak of his tent. He would not have the gap taken up now, for he had become strangely fond of it, as if the imperfection was a needed factor in the marvelous and private world into which he had again retreated. Here was Sheva at his side, and for the first time he was convinced she had given herself to him without even a hint of reserve. Now, with the first of day, he yearned to make some offering to the gods for the gift of this woman. I have merely to consider touching her, he thought, and I am roused. But she is more than that. Without words her lips confide more love and life to me than I have ever known. Even lying side by side with all our passion spent, we are still as one. We are life, and I have been so long in the business of death, I am even a little afraid of this that is between us. Is it too fragile to survive? Am I capable of handling it without breaking it? Little Jewess, of the marvelously smooth and amber body, little Jewess, who could not kill this troubled soldier, help me to comprehend your magic so I can give myself utterly to our future. You must not want for one thing in this world without my power to give you. He heard her moan gently, then stretch, and though her eyes were still closed, he heard her ask, "What are you staring at, General?" "How do you know I'm looking at anything? Your eyes are closed." She was silent. Then she said very softly, "I see you from within me. Sometimes I think I would know what you are doing, though you were a mile away. I am staring at the gap over my head. I'm not going to have it fixed as I first intended." "Why not?" "I do not know why not. I just like it. It announces the arrival of a new day quite as silently, but just as forcefully, as my conviction we must spend the rest of our lives together. To do otherwise would be a criminal insult to the gods." "God?" "As you please. What was the name of your wife? I have forgotten." "How can you possibly change from one subject to another so instantaneously?" "I am a woman."
Is that an excuse for an explanation? Her name was Livia. Were you in love with her? Yes, profoundly. But it was not the same. The same as now? Yes. There has never been anyone like you in my life. I cannot conceive of duplicating this sense of perfect union with any other woman. It is liar! He raised himself on one elbow so he could look down at her. Just what prompts you to say that? All Romans are liars. In your sleep you called out the name Eumedia. Who was she? Silva hesitated. He was amused at the ease with which she had accused him, and more so at his own pleasure in acceptance. The time has come at last, she thought. I am obviously ready to be domesticated. Eumedia was my concubine, unfortunately not a very happy one. Why? I do not care to discuss the why. I only wish she could see me now. Did you not love her as you did your wife? No. Then what was wrong with Eumedia? Nothing was really wrong with Eumedia. She tried and I tried. The fact we were drawn to each other made no difference. Now let us discuss other matters. I do not care to discuss other matters. I want to discuss what's wrong with Eumedia. Why suddenly should she be so important? Because Eumedia and Livia and Shevia are all related. If I should bear your child, they would be aunts. Your reasoning leaves me utterly confused. Livia was of a patrician family, very Roman, very quiet and studious. Eumedia was rather plump, a devoted gourmet, and of an exceedingly understanding and mellow nature. The contrast between all three of you is indescribable. Where could there be any possible relation? He saw the corners of her mouth quiver, in the beginning of a smile, and her eyes became mischievous. Right here, she said, reaching for him. Here is your Uncle Flavius, uncircumcised, but still charming. Laughing, he rolled upon her and silenced her mouth with his own. The gap at the peak had become a white-hot crescent of light, when they lay quietly again, and Sheva said to him, her breathing still hurried, Beloved liar, you exhaust me. I have no longer the strength to hate you. Then Rome progresses. Do you still propose to take me there? I am afraid of it. I am afraid I will not transplant well. Once you are surrounded by all that is familiar to you, I will not look the same. If you insist on staying in Palestine, I suppose it could be arranged. I will speak to the procurator, an acquaintance of mine named Silva. He's rather a clod in many ways, but he tries to be reasonable. What is he going to do to the Jews on Masada? He noticed a distinct change in her voice, and she seemed to draw away from him without actually moving. I do not know what he is going to do with them, since they stubbornly refuse any compromise. I am afraid the matter is out of his hands now. Why? Has he lost his command? He most certainly will if he fails to take Masada. And if it is now plain the Jews are not going to give it to him. So those on the mountain must die. We are not there yet. How can I live with myself? How can I live with you after... May I point out that you are not solely and personally responsible for the woes of the Jews, nor am I charged with the major policies of the Roman Empire. We are two people, nothing more. Everything is right for us. This is the month of April, so we are under the protection of Venus. Some people even make sacrifice to the Isis of Pharis, which is in your very own Alexandria. We should accept what the gods give us. We can argue about whether it was too much or too little when we are dead. Eleazar ben Yair was right. He said I was a disgrace to the Jewish nation. As usual, he twists the facts. There is no Jewish nation. Suddenly he stiffened and half rose on the couch. Here was all-pervading quiet again, and it was not the meal hour. Work on the ramp had ceased. He waited, cocking his head, as if to hear better. And still there was no resumption of the general noise. He glanced up at the gap in the tent, and then at the entrance. He listened alertly. The guards were engaged in an argument, apparently with a stranger. He heard one of them insisting the general was not to be disturbed. He sat up in bed and called out to them, "What is all that racket out there? Hold it down!" Then he heard the familiar voice of Paternus. "Sire, a messenger has come from the tribune Rubrius Gallus. He wishes to report the ramp is ready."